Hello, I'm King Link, and today let's talk about how Stardew Valley works. Stardew Valley is a popular game, but the one place I feel can be explored at a deeper level for it is the mechanics that the game uses to make its core systems work and remain interesting to users. I find that there's almost an addictive feeling to Stardew Valley at times, where the players just want to play one more day. Let's explore what causes players to keep coming back to Stardew Valley. Hopefully we'll be able to examine these mechanics beyond just how they feel, but also begin to understand how they are designed. I came up with the idea for this video not while playing Stardew Valley, but instead as I played Graveyard Keeper. I noticed similar systems that evoked similar feelings in me. Graveyard Keeper and Stardew Valley are both farming simulators, so this does make sense. The real question though is, what gameplay systems do they have in common, as well as where do they differ? At the same time, I should mention a third game that I will be showing off, my time at Portia. It also made me think of Stardew Valley's systems. It's not exactly a farming simulator in the same way, but it evokes many of the same experiences throughout the game. Now I can of course go back through a litany of games that also exhibit similar systems to these three games, but for this video I'm going to just focus on these three titles. The first feeling players will have with almost any game ever made is a sense of discovery. Whether you're picking up a controller for a new game or even a sequel of a series you already enjoy, either way there's going to be a sense of newness. How do the controls feel? Who's the main character? What abilities does the player have? Even what are the new modes in the game? All of these features are things that players will discover while looking at information on the game or just the first few minutes of gameplay. Think of this as a discovery phase. Most games run the player through a simple tutorial showing all the abilities that the player pretty much ever can get, and call it a day. The discovery phase about those games are quickly discarded to send the player through a story or handcrafted experience. That's definitely one way to design a game. Stardew Valley doesn't do this. There is an opening cinematic where the player is introduced to Stardew Valley, the farm, and learns how their character arrived there. From there, players are told how to plant their first seed through a simple quest system. Plant the seed, water it, let it grow. But there's so much more to learn that Stardew Valley doesn't teach in that tutorial. Just a few simple thoughts from a more experienced player can show the difference. The big one is the optimal layout of plants. There are also the best items to grow, even what each plant is used for, which will be unknown by new players. These are just pieces of the farming system in Stardew Valley, and there's a great deal more features of Stardew Valley that are left unsaid, such as foraging random items. New players may even think that they can only farm in their home zone, but the south area is also an open field to them if they actually want that. These, of course, are things that players will learn over time. Stardew Valley also has a couple of hint systems. The primary one is the television shows, but the discovery about the game's systems is a large part of the game since so much is left unsaid at first. For this, we need to focus on the method that players learn about these games as a major system. For Stardew Valley, there is a level of experimentation that can be done with the game, and players can do this, of course, but many players may not wish to do it. That's where the system does something interesting. You see, by giving the player so much unspoken information early on, it makes them wonder about many of these topics, such as what happens when you walk on plants. If players want to gain that knowledge about the game outside of itself, players will likely turn to other players or the internet. This is something similar to how Minecraft originally had its crafting system with a 3x3 grid and players having to discover those recipes or more likely look them up. At first glance this feels extremely inefficient and feels like bad game design, but I think this is a flawed look at the system. Yes, it's the game not telling the player the information he will eventually need, but this is then requiring the player to potentially get this information from a secondary source. The need for outside sources create an ability for players to discuss the game. I've discussed video games quite often with other people in my private life. Probably not surprising since I also have a YouTube channel about video games. For most games, this becomes isolated to discussing an amazing moment or a suggestion about which game they should play next, and that can only be done once or twice a title. Both Minecraft and Stardew Valley allow me to talk about a single game multiple times with the same group of people as we discuss new and interesting features that the game unlocks over time. By the point that you're diagramming out the optimal farming designs together, you start to realize there's something different about Stardew Valley. The different ways information can be gained is important to Stardew Valley's success. It creates a cottage industry for Stardew Valley. Players have many options, though, such as discussing the game with friends, reaching out to social media groups, subreddits, and now even Discords. The players can also read articles as well as use wikis. From there, they can continue to use any of these sources and discuss the game with other players or help build out their knowledge bases. Each of these methods creates a community, whether it be a community talking about the game, a single place to get data like the wikis, or websites constantly writing articles on the game. These become major sources of information and help grow Stardew Valley because it's a topic that can continue to be discussed time and time again. To loop back to the players I mentioned earlier, though, who decided to experiment with the game rather than race out and look up guides, those players can similarly share their findings with others and allow them to also join parts of the communities, websites, and wikis that have grown not to just gain knowledge, but to share their own and perhaps bask in understanding a rare mechanic. This is all due to a simple step of game design, or rather perhaps a lack of an in-depth tutorial. I'm not sure all of this is intentional, but dear God, it works. Stardew Valley created communities devoted to it because of how players are expected to discover information about it and continue to share information about the game after that point. Once these communities are created, many people will continue to add to these communities long past the time that they play the game. They become fans of the game, almost tribal in some ways, sharing art and more with their new community of friends based on the love of a single game. Just to put how well this has worked in perspective, Stardew Valley's subreddit has 500,000 subscribers, which puts it at the point that it's one of the top 30 gaming subreddits or so. It's approximately the same size as the Red Dead Redemption subreddit for a game made by a single person against one of the biggest titles out there. There is a similar type of discovery in each of the 3 games that we're talking about today, but they've reached different levels of success, however. My time at Portia feels like it's given just enough assistance to the player so that they can discover many parts of the games without outside assistance. There are still wikis and communities devoted to my time at Portia. In hindsight, however, it seems that my time at Portia does a bit too much to require forming larger groups about the game. Admittedly, part of the reason that Stardew Valley's groups took off was the immense popularity of the game, which only created a feedback loop to talking about the game. However, in my time at Portia, much of the player's time discovering features of the game can be done inside the game itself with the wealth of information. Essentially, my time at Portia may have done too good of a job teaching the player that players didn't have to create those alternate avenues of information sharing, and honestly, it's a bit of a shame. There are discoveries such as new pieces of equipment for players to use in his workshop area, but most of the time it's very clear what can be developed by each station or which station is required for the next step of progression. And finally, Graveyard Keeper suffers from a different type of feedback. Many of the systems in Graveyard Keeper are limited in their locations, so while there are farms of a sort in Graveyard Keeper, players are limited in where they can build and what they can develop at each location. In Stardew Valley, players progress about the same way throughout the game, with some specialization possible, but most players will tend to end up at the same point. In Graveyard Keeper, there are many choices, especially in the skill tree, and some choices will result in different goals and potential styles of play. Much of the advice of Graveyard Keeper is more about which skills are necessary or how to effectively farm experience to get to the next level. The information and discussions isn't as important as many tips and tricks are limited to where players can find required items. In this case, it's not systems being demystified, but rather explaining what Graveyard Keeper requires a player to do or buy before they can accomplish a goal. This still works, but it's not as deep as understanding larger gameplay systems and thus perhaps less effective. Now, the second phase that Stardew Valley reaches is to create short-term goals that players can focus on. This allows the game to give players targets and goals that they can chase or work towards. Think of this as a way to give players positive feedback almost immediately to say they're doing the right thing or have figured out parts of the game. One of the first issues players will run into almost immediately in Stardew Valley is a lack of space in their bags. Players start with only 12 slots to carry items, which are also the 12 quick-use slots, and that's an extremely underwhelming amount. With 5 tools immediately handed to the player at the beginning of the game, and a 6th and a 7th tool coming shortly after as a fishing pole and a sword, likely in that order, that leaves the player with 5 item slots Those 5 slots are all the goods that players can carry. Everything else is left on the ground, thrown out, or sold. Now there are 2 steps players will need to do as soon as possible. The first is to build a chest and start using the additional storage provided by it. This forces players to toy with the crafting system to find the option, and that is part of the UI. As a small note, if there's a major problem with Stardew Valley, it's that UI system. It feels clunky and almost is hidden away before players learn where it is and how much utility that the pause menu has. But the chest will be one of the first things players will want to build, and it is remarkably helpful, especially when players start placing their tools in there that they're not using daily to free up space. The second solution to the inventory issues is given to the player in a letter the day after the player maxes their inventory for the first time. Players are told that Pierre's shop has a backpack for sale. The new backpack has 24 slots, doubling the size of the inventory. It's going to be something players want to upgrade to. A quick trip to the store, and you learn the backpack will cost 2,000 gold. A decent amount of money, but with hundreds of gold coming in on many nights, this can be a relatively fast goal, depending on how much players invest in future crops, of course. Smart players will balance new crops by saving some money for that additional space. Once you buy that backpack, suddenly the shop has an even bigger bag for 10,000 gold, but it's setting the player on another short-term goal. This is of course a finite system, and we're already on the last step of it, but it's a perfect example of the player being given a small reachable goal that will take some amount of time and effort, but that will have the end in sight from the first moments of that task. We can talk about how to develop a proper economy in another video, and if Stardew Valley does this well or not, and honestly it does a great job for the most part. This is however the first major goal that players will have in Stardew Valley. Before long, players are going to be asked multiple additional goals. For example, there's the community center goals that ask for the player to gather a certain amount of objects, as well as giving the player a chance to upgrade the early tools that they are given. Then there is the adventurer guild, fishing, and if you're considering romancing a certain character, that can be an early goal that you can work on. I'm of course limiting myself to the early game as there's a huge set of goals and tasks players are going to be given throughout the game, and players can tackle any of these goals or potentially give up on other goals if they wish. Let's return once again to Graveyard Keeper. The short-term goals in Graveyard Keeper are of course different, but again, early tasks give you a reason to press on with the game to complete more. Within the first hour, the bishop tells you to improve your graveyard, which can be done by small improvements over time. A bigger short-term quest is the barman at the tavern in town tells you about Miss Charm and Snake, 2 different characters who can hopefully help you out. And then players will have to find Snake and talk to Miss Charm and work with both of them until you can earn the appropriate reward. What is interesting in Graveyard Keeper is that it doesn't treat these as just fetch quests. It's not simple enough to find Snake or meet Miss Charm. Both characters will then only set you out on their significant quest lines, and the entire mechanic of these short-term quests require you to befriend people and play with Graveyard Keeper's relationship system, which is chock full of more quests. Graveyard Keeper also has a series of short-term goals in the form of their crafting and leveling system. Early on in the game, the players will have specific items and crafts that they want to build, and through the leveling system, players will have to unlock them by building up experience points through the variety of the game's systems. A lot of the early requests by the relationship systems require specific upgrades or items purchased from the right people, so players will have to chase either money, experience points, or more likely both. And in my time at Portia, you'll often be tasked with designing a specific item as part of a quest system, which as the game moves on, you'll have to often build smaller pieces in the blueprints from other blueprints before making that final design. Similarly, the game will also give you a quest to build a specific item days or even weeks before you have the right blueprint or the right tools for that assignment, and that allows players to keep their eye on the prize while still exploring the world. The entire quest system in my time at Portia is chopped up as short-term goals, where players can usually finish a couple story quests in a sitting and easily tackle daily quests as part of a morning routine. Now, with my talking about these short-term goals, I think the third and final phase I want to talk about here should be a bit obvious. They are the long-term goals, or more specifically, the endgame goals of these games. In Stardew Valley, there are many of these goals, including completing the community center, the museum collection, catching every fish, shipping every possible item, and more. Many of these endgame goals are completionist goals, and tasks that will take players a great deal of time to accomplish. However, it's important to consider these because if a player wants to complete everything in Stardew Valley, they'll have to complete each of these goals. Many of the achievements also create a series of short-term goals, such as completing each bundle as part of the community center or just discovering each item that you'll ultimately have to ship. Unlike the discovery aspect and the short-term goals, the endgame goals are intended to be a small, finite resource. There are only a certain amount of high-level achievements a game will have, but many of these goals will take players a significant amount of time. Just reaching the end of the story can take players close to 50 hours, but to do everything in the endgame goals will take players 100 hours, 150, or even more. This can give an ultimate purpose to a player's gameplay and the goal that they're trying to complete beyond just having fun with the system. For Stardew Valley, the game really will end when you finish all the achievements, but again, each game is different. For My Time at Portia, there's a rather large and complex story that takes a significant amount of time to reach. Here we're again talking about over 50 hours of gameplay, though unlike Stardew Valley, where players have to run out the clock to see the ending cutscene, assuming they've earned a significant chunk of change, My Time at Portia has a heavily directed story that continues far longer than I expected. Though completionists will be able to sink more time into collecting everything in the game in My Time at Portia, especially with the museum here as well. And Graveyard Keeper as well focuses more on the story about getting the main character home than larger endgame goals beyond that. In this case, I don't believe players will find much to chase outside of the main story, though that's really up for them to decide. Here at least you'll have a very focused game that keeps players on that primary goal of getting home, as it's the main thrust of the game. But the reason why I'm bringing up these three specific phases of gameplay is that each game effortlessly combines all three phases into a series of mechanics that will hand off to each other. There's a point where Stardew Valley's players will be chasing the backpack when the game interrupts them and announces either the mines or the community center is open. All of a sudden, the player has something new to understand and discover. Rather than staying focused on only the short-term goal that they were chasing, they were given a new long-term goal of completing the community center or diving to the bottom of the mines, as well as new short-term goals on the way to get there, and being forced to discover all these new features of the game. Stardew Valley seems to effortlessly switch between each of these systems, and it makes for a more interesting game. Even completing a set of bundles in Stardew Valley's community center only opens up new content, or bundles, that can then be explored and discovered, which leads to new short-term goals, and we're in a clear cycle here where each step in the game leads to one of the three phases, and often all three. This is rather effective as it gates content, but rather than gating it behind meaningless grinds, players have very specific goals to open up more of the world or game. While only a few of these goals are really special in hindsight, it still keeps players attached to the game to see what might happen next. And similarly, both Graveyard Keeper and My Time at Portia works in the same way over the course, switching between discovery, short-term, and endgame goals, usually cycling back multiple times. And it's in the form of collections or the main story of the game for both of them. I've spoken quite a bit here, but I want to make a quick mention of one thing that all three games seem to achieve. Players can't fail, or rather, it's extremely hard for players to do very poorly in any of these games. You can run out of money or lose an important resource, but there's always a way to move forward towards the ultimate goal, whatever yours may be. The lack of a fail state enhances the player's abilities to experiment and try new things in all three games. A lack of spoilers also helps build communities, but that topic is something for another time. The point is, players can do what they want in the game, even if it's not the best, because the game will never punish the player harshly. This shouldn't be how every game works, of course. Fail states are important, but it works very well in these series. Now, before we leave, though, I want to take a quick moment and discuss how these designs actually work on the gamers directly. In 1996, Richard Bartle published a paper illustrating 4 types of gamers. Very simply, his paper says there are killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. I don't want to go too deep into the theory. There are alternate versions of the 4 types of gamers, including larger numbers of gamers, or if this is even the best model. It's one of the original models, and I think it holds up well today. Though I will, of course, mention that Bartle was focused more on MMORPGs than general games, but it is relatively acceptable for all games to be judged this way. The fact is, all 4 of these categories are contained in these games. All 3 games have some level of combat for the killer players. Of course, killers are going to be easy to please for the most part, but they also have many options out there, especially like the first-person shooters and most games. Admittedly, none of these games have amazing combat, but it does exist, and truthfully, each game is more focused on appealing to those outside of this dynamic. But the combat is important to some players. Achievers can actually be a bit easier to please nowadays because with the creation of the Xbox achievement system and every other version of that, it's easy to get someone to have a goal to chase. Though Nintendo still lacks that feature, of course. I've been a bit clear in these games how they build goals and achievements, and those systems will directly target players who are achievers. Explorers can experience these worlds and complex systems to discover anything from the optimal way to play the game or just what the world has in store for them. Experimentation with the systems can entertain people for quite a while, as well as tying some goals and achievements in all 3 games to unlocking more of the world or features for the players to explore further or experiment with. And for those socializers, we've kind of discussed this with Discovery, but just discussing these games with other people, sharing discoveries, finding out how other people have approached the games is quite a deep topic. It all comes back to socialization though, and that's why Stardew Valley really has done so well. While it might not have intentionally attempted to build those communities mentioned in the Discovery phase above, it has succeeded, and that has only helped these games grow. Over 10 million copies of Stardew Valley has been sold in under 4 years since release. The other 3 types of gamers will pick up games and play them, maybe mention them to friends, but it's the social aspects that have kept Stardew relevant for over 4 years, and it's the reason that it's still going strong. And that's honestly how I think Stardew Valley works. Now, I've mentioned 3 games in this video and shown footage of them. Stardew Valley is an absolutely great game, and if you're watching this video without having played it already, I highly recommend you change that if any of this footage has interested you. The Android version of Stardew Valley is really impressive and I can easily recommend it, and I've sunk over 100 hours into the PC version alone, but every version of this game works and it's still worth getting. At the same time, I also will recommend players pick up My Time at Portia if they're fans of Stardew. I honestly do think it's done some things better than Stardew, and admittedly some things are a bit weaker. It isn't the same game as Stardew Valley though. It has a higher focus on crafting instead of farming, and it is 3D graphics instead of 2D, but these changes help make it feel fresh. And finally, our macabre version of Stardew Valley, Graveyard Keeper, that has started this video. I'm willing to recommend that game as well. It's not perfect. It lacks a few things that would have made it a better game, especially in how most of the systems are not as deep as the other 2 games, but I've had a blast playing it as well, and I think it's well worth your time. If you've come this far, thank you very much for watching this video. If you want to see more from me, including more videos like this, please subscribe and ring that bell for notifications. This is something a little bit different than I've done in the past. I love talking games, but the fact is, I think it's more interesting if we actually start focusing more on the mechanics of games and even genres that can work or perhaps not work rather than reviewing a specific game. These videos take a little bit longer to put together, but I think they're more interesting and valuable to people. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. I'm actually going to throw a little poll down in the description to see what topics people might be interested for the future. But if there's a video, genre, topic, or specific game you want me to tackle, let me know in the comments or on that poll. I'm going to be popping up a review I have of My Time at Portia if you want to see more about it, as well as an old review of a game called Staxel. It's very similar to Stardew Valley, but just not done as well. Until then, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.